Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the beginning of Halloween movie madness here on Cinema Crusaders. So, I am so glad to be here with you. I am Nim, your host for today. And in just a moment, I'm going to welcome my co host, but I just want to let you know today we're going to be talking about the 1931 film Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, kind of kicked off the whole Universal Monsters craze. And I think it's fair to say it kicked off the whole Halloween themed horror movies to a different level in Hollywood. So we're going to get right into that. But first, I want to introduce my fellow children of the night, Cinema Crusaders, who are going to be here with me. First of all, I want to introduce to you a fellow filmmaker. He's made some horror themed short stories himself, which I love. You can go check out on Warehouse 9. He's none other than filmmaker extraordinaire and fellow Cinema Crusader, Lance Lucero. How you doing, Lance?
Hey, howdy. It's good to be here. That's a cool new intro. I like that.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to this Halloween movie madness. I think it's going to be great. So, next up is none other than the man who is creating Mr. Happy comics. He's doing artwork for another comic book company, which I don't know if that's out yet, so I'm not going to share that. He's out there. He's a writer. He's a Cinema Crusader. He's a comic crusader. He's none other than Jeff Bracey. How you doing, Jeff?
Good. I'm good. I'm wearing my spooky Halloween shirt and my Freddy Krueger hat for the occasion.
Outstanding.
This time of year, I turn into not Mr. Happy, but Mr. Halloween. And as of yet, there has been no official announcement, so I guess we'll just hold off on mentioning the current comic project.
Cool. So just look for that. When we get the official word, we'll announce that. But I know I have some behind the scenes footage news as do other people of what he's working on, and I'm excited to be able to share that with you. So. Also, we have a writer extraordinaire from he works for Omen Comics. He also does. Blanking for a second. Comic Crusaders, retro reviews all the time. He does some great stuff. Recently, I think he did some things with X-Men, Chris Claremont. He does retro movie reviews. He's on this several podcasts. This man is busy. My good friend, I'd like to welcome Shadewing, Steve Sellers. How are you doing, Steve?
The blood is alive. I will say this is the first time I've ever seen this movie. I'm really looking forward to discussing it, and so yeah, I'm right here.
Well, I have to say before I introduce my last co-host that I was almost tempted to do not Bela Lugosi, but there was another guy I love who did a parody of Bela Lugosi on the Howard Stern show, and it was Dracula Gottfried. So with Gilbert Gottfried,
that sounds hilarious.
So. And last but not least, I want to introduce the man who is all over the con scene. He's back into it. He's also the host of Awesome Sauce Radio on Wednesdays. Got to check that out. My good friend, Cinema Crusader, Comic Crusader, Blind Adam. How you doing, Adam?
I'm doing well. Recovered from my one day at New York Comic Con and getting ready for another convention, which I'll be kind enough not to mention on this show, but if you watch my show, you know what I'm talking about. And looking forward to talking about Dracula.
I will give you a little bit of a sneak peek, everybody. We did an interview with someone who did a biography of Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi was a famous ladies man, an infamous ladies man. And Adam is kind of your gateway drug if you want to get into the side of comics and adult entertainment and how they mix together. So if you're those kind of things are interested, you want to get into that, definitely check out Awesome Sauce Radio. Great show. You got to check it out. So without further ado, let's kick off Halloween movie madness and talk about this movie, Dracula, 1931 edition, starring Bela Lugosi. Just quick, I want to go around the horn here and have everybody just give me your initial impressions of this movie and what it means to you or what you think it means to horror as a genre. So I'm going to kick it off. I'm just going to go right in the order that we introduced everybody. So Lance, what do you think about this movie as a whole?
Well, it's kind of funny. I think it was originally marketed it as a romance because it was released, I believe, on Valentine's Day, the 14th February, 1931. So that kind of sets the tone of how they kind of didn't know how to market it. And is it a romance in a sense? It kind of could be, but I think the reputation that it followed from the Broadway stage version was leaning a little bit towards to a psychological thriller, because I'm not even sure if it, horror in itself was it a genre in 1931. We're very experimental with this film. This film is very experimental. We're talking only 4 years after the first talkie. This is a fresh talkie film. So to me, it's an experiment still. They were still experimenting with what they can do in cinema. So it's a landmark picture of its time because of how it pioneered cinema in general. This was it's an important movie. It needs to be recognized, and it falls in the genre nowadays of horror. People just automatically think of it as such. It is much more than that, though. It is cinema history that needs to be studied, and they did it pretty dang good for what they were dealing with back in the day. I think they did it right.
I think it's so interesting that you said that, because I mean there were some horror movies in the silent movie era. I mean, most notably I can think of Nosferatu, some other things like that, but they were few and far between. But what I think is interesting is that I think once they picked up on the fact that what this movie, the hold it had on the general audience, they started really marketing the heck out of it, to the point where I found out that during screenings of this movie, the studio was hiring nurses to go and stand in the back of the theaters to kind of give people a heads up. And then women were fainting and having to be dragged out of the movie, while it was playing, and you watch the movie now. And for us in the modern audiences, we're like, okay, we enjoy the movie, but it's nothing that's going to like send us running through, screaming through the aisles. But back then it was just, it absolutely had this huge impact on. And it was obvious that people flocked to it. So, it was obvious that people wanted more. And I don't know. I think your point is well taken. I don't think that they realized that there is this appetite for this type of film. So, Jeff, what do you think about Dracula? What are your digital impressions? What has this movie meant to you, or meant in general?
That's really interesting, the stuff Lance said. There's some stuff I didn't realize. I didn't realize they didn't know how to market it at the time, especially considering that the silent era did produce notable horror films that were legitimately horror films. Nosferatu, Dergolum, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, even Edison's Frankenstein, were all legitimate horror films. And so there were people understood, even before talkies came out, what horror was and how to use it effectively. So to find out that Universal was trying to do a horror, but not really seeming to know what it was or how to deal with it, that's really interesting to me, especially marketing it as a romance. When you watch the film, it's you really can't define it as a romance. Looking at it from my perspective, it's definitely got the elements of gothic horror in there. I agree with Lance that this is very much an important moment, a milestone in American cinema, because a great many of those horror films I did mention were coming from Europe. So this was kind of us really dipping our toes into it. I hadn't watched Dracula in decades, so rewatching the film today enlightened me to a number of things that your memory of things can be a little fuzzy. Things that you think are iconically set in stone, and you're like, watch the film like, oh, it's not. And looking back on it, it's very iconic, mostly for the presence of certain members of the cast. Dwight Frye is a standout as Renfield. Lugosi, of course, steals the show as Dracula, and the wonderful gentleman playing Abraham Van Helsing. And so even today, for me, it still holds up in a lot of ways. Because of that, I still very much enjoy it. but there is that it holds up enough that you still enjoy it, even though, like you said, culturally we've moved so far beyond that. Like people aren't going to faint in the seats of this, but I remember similar reactions with The Exorcist. I don't know beyond maybe the most successfully marketed film in history, to my mind, the Blair Witch Project. I don't recall there being a similar effect in modern times, but yeah, this film for me is a milestone. I still love it. Watching it just to increase my love for it, even though now I see a lot of flaws in it, but it's still worth watching.
I think it's interesting you said that about the Blair Witch Project, because there have been movies. It's just been a different effect. I remember with the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity, people suspended disbelief, and a lot of people believed at the time and for long moments afterwards that it was real. And then
the most brilliant marketing campaign ever.
Yeah, I mean, there was always this
War of the Worlds.
Yeah, there was almost this mass hysteria about those films, but that's a whole other classification, and maybe someday we'll get into those movies. I could take or leave them, but that's a whole other subject. So then on to Steve. Dracula, talking a little bit about this movie, but also about the fact that I think it's interesting, like Lance said, this was one of the first talkies, and we're going to get into Bela Lugosi because I think he's a subject all to himself. But what did you think about this movie as a talkie, as a horror movie that took off and captured the public's imagination? And how did this movie affect you in any way?
Yeah, I really was thinking, like, even as I was watching it not that long ago, that there was a definite silent film feel to some of the performances. Definitely the guy that plays Renfield looked like he had been a silent film actor at one point, and as was said, that this was like only a few years after the silent era, so you can definitely see they're trying to make that transition between the way that they made silent films and the way that they made talkies. And you can definitely tell that they struggle a little bit with it. There's actually one moment where I think there was a document or something being handed off, and it looks like a still image rather than a moving picture. That looks like a holdover from the silent era to a certain extent, that kind of thing. In terms of the movie itself, though, I'm looking at this in a couple of respects. One is the movie for what it is, and another as an adaptation of the book. They really took liberties with the book, but there are a lot of things that are true to the book. Because basically the part of Renfield early on was originally done by Harker. So they kind of fused the Renfield character together with Harker at the beginning of the book, maybe because they wanted to make it more streamlined. And there are points where it works and points where it doesn't, and we can get into that. There are other different things. They cut out the entire ending past the Carfax Abbey stuff. They just leave it at Carfax Abbey. They don't talk about the trace down the Borgo Pass and the fight down at Castle Dracula and all these other things. We don't see all that. It just kind of ends at Carfax Abbey for some reason. And you can kind of debate whether that works or doesn't. But it is kind of an interesting take, though. And some of the things that it adds are really, really interesting. I think that Van Helsing's role, I think, is very interesting in this version of the movie. For example, that whole fight that he has with Dracula with the Battle of Wills is really, really well done. So you have all of these little elements where, yeah, it's not as good of an adaptation of the book to me as something like, say, Bram Stoker's Dracula from Coppola. But at the same time, for what it is, it comes pretty close for 1931. The special effects are better than you would expect for 1931. Silly bats on strings aside. And overall, I respected it before, but I think I have a new appreciation for it now.
Now, that's interesting you said about the book, because I felt the same way. I think one of the things that caused it to change is that this movie, like I think Lance was mentioning, followed the Broadway adaptation of, there was a Broadway that ran in London and then in New York. And I think some of those scenes were probably cut out of the Broadway adaptation because it was practically impossible to do a lot of that stuff at Broadway. And so the screenplay for this movie came from that film. Maybe at the end, I'd like us to contrast this movie with the Gary Oldman version in '92, which I think was much closer to the book and everything that happened. But if you
Lugosi is kind of hard to shake off, isn't he? His performance is so charismatic.
Exactly, and it's like even to this day, I think vampires and the look in this movie and the sound and the presence of Bela Lugosi as Dracula just carries over. It's in the zeitgeist, to use a big German
can I
word.
add an odd bit of trivia?
Sure.
All right, so this film is actually adapted, as you guys have mentioned, from the stage play, which Bela Lugosi was a star in. Coincidentally, in 1979, Frank Langella would reprise. He would be the role of Dracula for Dracula in 1979, and that was also adapted from the stage play that he was starring in at the time.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there have been so many people who have played this character. From varied as from Christopher Lee to parody versions played by Leslie Nielsen. So it's just like it's all over the place. And yet, the one that I still think sticks in the public's mind is that one that and this is crazy to even say, almost 100 years ago. This movie is 90 years old.
Another 10 years, man. Another 10 years.
Yep.
I mean, that is just incredible to think about, that this movie is almost a century old and we're watching it, and we enjoy it. So it's taking a while to get to you, but Adam, Dracula, what do you think about this film?
This is one sexy vampire movie.
Okay.
I love how it's scored. Lugosi is big pimping as Dracula, and at the end of the day, this is more a romance than it is a horror story for me.
It's funny you say that. The brides of Dracula in this movie I thought were really well done. So, they were pretty spooky for the, even now, they had that look, and this was 1931. I thought they captured that very well.
Because my first experience with this movie was from a hardcover book that was a storybook of the actual movie.
Huh.
Okay.
Nice.
I had the coolest school library growing up. It had all the
we had a book in our library too. Wow.
Yeah. So I initially read them, and then I got this box of VHS tapes for a birthday gift, and that's how I discovered Dracula.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and it's going back again to the marketing thing, and speaking about how and I'm just gonna say this real quick, and then we're gonna get into production and talk about that production value. I really don't think even after this movie took off, they had a real clear idea of what to do, and Lugosi was bitter about that. I mean, one of the things I learned is that they kept using Lugosi in all of these promotional roles for things that were crazy. And one of the funniest ones is that famously Lugosi had in the 1920s had an affair with the actress who inspired the character of Betty Boop. And so in 1950, I think it was the 50s or the 40s, the Betty Boop cartoon came out. And the voice actress who voiced Betty Boop was there. And as part of the promotion for that film, during for those cartoons, during Valentine's Day, they had Dracula come and try and seduce Betty Boop, his voice actor. To the point where he's standing behind a bush going, Betty Boop, you've booped your last boop, like that. So
he would have been so canceled today.
Yeah. So it's just, I really think it took them a long time. And I think almost to the point where it's almost the late 40s, early 50s where they really hit their stride and realized what they had on their hands. So let's get into production. And there's a lot of us. So, I just kind of want everybody to hit on what their points of how they feel about this movie and its importance going forward and stuff like that. instead of we're going to go through each specific topic. But I think it's important to talk about because, like several of you mentioned, there's a lot of things in here that either set the standard or were groundbreaking, or there was a number of things that happened. And this was also a transitory film, like you're talking, between silent pictures and talkies. So I'm going to start with Lance on this one as well, because he's our movie maker, and I'd love to hear his take on these things, and then we'll go around the horn in counterclockwise order. So, Lance, the production value of this movie, what do you see in it that's like a really important point that you think to take away from this film if you're looking at it from a filmmaker's perspective?
Well, one, of course, it's shot on film. And even back then, it was an extremely difficult thing to do. And building, Carl, Laemmle building the whole production around, this movie with sets and locations, of course, all on the Universal backlot, is pretty impressive for its time. I mean, even though you can see, these cameras were monstrous and they couldn't move them as easily as you can move cameras today. It's really interesting to see, how it's fixed and how they capture the whole image of the environment, kind of like you're watching a stage play. So this is where your silent film and stage play kind of clash a little bit, because they didn't have it yet. They really didn't have it down. Whereas you can in silent film, you motivate your action by action, which is a lot easier to do. But now you're adding dialogue to that action, and even performances were a little bit different. You can see a theatrical performance on screen that they were capturing, with film. And, the old Western, I think Western electric sound systems that they were using were just as big of a beast as the cameras were. So, it's an achievement what they did. And if you noticed, there's not a soundtrack to the movie. You have music at the beginning and the end. And that's pretty much it, because really they weren't there yet with putting soundtracks to movies and understanding the beats of the sound and where it would be distracting or where it would clash with dialogue. We're talking pitch levels. We're talking analog sound, which is a completely different animal than digital. What they achieved was extremely impressive for its time, not counting, the awesome sets and the makeup. It's a case study. It's something to be studied. When you look at cinema, an important film, and it's always cool to see how they've restored it, to so that we can watch it like on Blu-ray today, because I have the Blu-rays with all the special features, and to see how they restored it and repaired it. Of course, it may not be 100% like the director wanted, but it's archived in a way that I think would please a movie maker, because now the resolution is just amazing. You can see depth in the shadows. The movie's a painting. Every shot of this movie is like a painting. And to achieve that is difficult, especially in black and white, because now you're not dealing with the color spectrum, you're dealing with the grayscale. And how they achieve this is pretty magnificent. They've been working with film for a while, but this scope was a little bit differently, achieved a little bit differently. And having said that, it's a win. It's a success. It's very impressive, just very impressive for its time.
It's interesting, commenting on the score. I'm not sure why they picked this particular piece of music, which is Swan Lake, to go with Dracula. It's almost feeds into that Valentine's Day and romance angle again, but it worked for some reason. It really did, and it's a little bit jarring. When I first saw this movie as a kid, I wasn't very familiar with Swan Lake. I think my parents had put it on a couple times and listened to it, so I didn't know it right off the bat. But when I watched this movie again in preparation for this pod, I was like, that is really odd that they're playing the movie from a ballet and in this film. So that was a strange choice, but it was a choice that worked. And it's so interesting to think that they basically just copy pasted a selection from a ballet that had been written in the century prior, and put it in this film, versus all the money that goes into sound score and everything now. So a very interesting fact there. So I'm going to go to Adam. What from the production of this film stands out to you, or do you think is really important that you'd want to highlight?
I really enjoy the score a lot.
Okay.
It has a really spooky vibe to the music. I'm gonna have to go back and check out the whole ballet thing, because I did not notice it when I watched it this time around.
Yeah, the music at the beginning and end is from Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky.
Really? I never noticed that before. I also, through it being the first movie ever done on the Universal lot like this, this is what ushers in all the other Universal monster series of films throughout the rest of the time, which always fascinates me. And a lot of the other things, unfortunately, audio description would be a great help, but I think that's an option that if I had the Blu-ray, I would be able to have done, but because I watched it on YouTube, just wasn't an option for that particular, great channel called History of Cinema. Was been showing some film movies, so that's how I wound up watching it for this.
I think your point about the lot is very interesting as well. It definitely has. You could tell that a lot of this was, I think maybe probably all of it was shot on a soundstage, but even the sets definitely had a theater-like feel, a live theater feel to it. Especially
it looked like they were still figuring out how to translate a stage play onto a, film it for film aspect to it.
Yeah. And I do have to give a shout out on this one. It always amazes me whenever they would film these old films on sound stages, that whoever the background artist was. So there's a scene where the carriage is rolling into the town at the beginning of the movie, and they're going through the past. Well, that's a giant sound stage, but the background, you see the vista, the horizon with all the hills and everything. All of that was painted by somebody and then hoisted up there. It's just an incredible amount of work, and the level of skill that it took. There was no green screen. There was no back projection at that time. Every time you saw a background in a window or anything else, it was an actual physical painting that someone did, which is just a really incredible, fascinating thing. In fact, I'd love to know where some of those are. Did they get trashed or were they preserved? Because I think they deserve to be preserved and enjoyed, for forever. So
absolutely.
I'm going to go Steve next on production value. What did you think, Steve, on what stood out for you of the production of this film?
I really love the set designs. I felt that they did a really, really good job in making them look believable for the time. I think that all the scenes of like the Abbey, they look really, really spooky. The scenes set in Transylvania where, it's not like exactly accurate, but it looks like it could be Transylvania. The use of fog, they use a lot of really good fog projectors for this. And that also ends up hiding the mood in all of these elements. And just generally, I think it's a really good use of black and white. There are certain films that I think really work better in black and white, and something like a noir or a horror, like this one generally is, even with the romance elements, really, really works better this way, with the sense of moral ambiguity and all of these things. But one thing I really appreciate is how much this film doesn't rely on blood or gore or anything like this. It's psychological horror to the extent that horror is involved at all. The kills or the attacks by Dracula are implied. We get to see elements that show that they've been attacked. We see Lucy wearing the scarf. All of these sort of things. We never see the wounds directly. We never see any blood directly. And yet, the way that it's shot and the way that it's filmed is so good that you don't doubt that this is what happened in the context of the narrative. All of these elements just work visually. There is a continuity to it. And just visually, I think everything holds together really, really well. They did a really good job of it. The only thing that I would say is there are occasionally little elements that don't age well, or maybe today would have been done better. The bat flying on the wires is just one of those things that today I think a lot of people would look at that and laugh a little bit. But I mean, that's just one moment in an otherwise really well designed and shot film. And I would say that it works really well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you on some of those physical elements. Also, there was a spider that was running around at one point. They didn't have the capability to do that well. I think a lot of this was groundbreaking. They were trying to figure out how to do stuff like this. A question I want to put in all of your minds, and then we'll hit it at the end of, on the back end of the show. I think you brought up a great point about how they never show the blood and guts. Do you think this movie had a greater impact at that time? Because this is the beginning of movies. We had, beginning of talkies, but we had silent pictures, but we even hadn't had those for that long. A lot of people still read. People used their imaginations to build things. Do you think that that's why it had a great impact then versus now? People don't want to imagine what's going on. They kind of want to be shown. They want to actually see the bite and the blood and everything. So think about that, and we'll get into it on how this movie translates to modern audiences at the back end. So, but next I want to go to Jeff on production. Production value, production, what this movie brought. What do you think?
I'm glad you mentioned the matte paintings. That's something I was going to touch on myself, because that was one of the first visual elements that hit me, was the beautiful mountainscape as the coach is coming into Transylvania, and later on when it's approaching Castle Dracula. And it's like you said, these are these huge things that are painted and hoisted up so they really fit into the scene. And this was being an artist myself, this was an art form I appreciated for a long time until things went completely digital. I remember watching behind the scenes on things like Star Wars and the History of the World Part 1, where you'd find out matte paintings were used to extend a scene in that movie in History of the World, and the level of detail it goes into. In Star Wars, they would do matte paintings on glass so they could shine a light through. So when Luke's fighting Vader over the chasm on Bespin, all those little lights are light being projected through this vast matte painting. And so this is just a wonderful art form that is sadly pretty much gone. I think the last time I saw this was in the Dune TV series, and that was still kind of a painting projected on a screen from the behind. The sets are amazing. One thing that immediately strikes me is when you first encounter Dracula as Dracula, you have the broadest staircase I've ever seen in any film. It looks like an army could march up and down this thing, and it's a tremendous set piece. And it's kind of bookended by another amazing stairway at the end of the film at Carfax Abbey, where Dracula is taking Mina away, and he ends up destroying Renfield on this staircase. It's just visually stunning, and the fact that they put so much time and effort into making these things, and I love so many of the little details that they do to just really enhance things. Like when Dracula comes down the staircase and goes back up the staircase, and this part of the castle is decrepit. It's all full of these spider webs, and you see the spider skittering away later on. And an important note here is you've seen Dracula come down the stairs and then back up the stairs, and as Renfield follows him, he has to take his cane and make a path through the webbing, but Dracula surely had passed through that. And it was just a brilliant little technical aspect there that if you're not paying attention, just already in showing the supernatural power of this creature. And you can see the framing of things is very much from a stage play or a silent film perspective. There's a lot of lockdown shots. I don't think there's really any camera movement at all in the film, which is also interesting because, as Lance will know, the this film was also being made for Mexican and Spanish audiences at the same time on the exact same sets. I think the performances of the actors in that are not equal to what we get in the English-speaking cast, but they did manage to do, in my mind, more interesting things with the camera in the iteration of the film. And I would actually like to see a blending of the two. It might be a fun edit project sometime to, like, you know, intercut this camera move and like put Lugosi and stuff, in these scenes.
Well,
I
that'd be
think it was
interesting.
more, yeah, I think it'd be more effective that way. But it was, like Lance has said, this was all groundbreaking for the time. So different people were doing different things with it. And it's really worthwhile to see both versions if you get the opportunity to do so. Steve has mentioned the brilliant use of fog in the film, and it's exceedingly well done. And so the last thing I'll touch on that really just heightens the production of this is the lighting. The lighting really owes a lot to the silent era, and specifically the way they craft it. And it's like as Lance was saying, like, it's a painting in images. And one of my favorite YouTube channels to watch for film production is Every Frame of Painting, and that applies to this so much. Where you're painting in light and shadow, you're creating this whole element of chiaroscuro on the screen, and the moments where they'd zoom in on Lugosi and they'd have that really cool light effect just across his piercing eyes as you see him mesmerizing people, or when he has these moments where the vampire comes out, he sees the blood, or the desire for somebody like wells up within him, and it just really highlights that. It's a technique that would be used again and again and again for decades thereafter because it's so damn effective. But I really like the way that they used light to just create the mood and the tension and evoke the mystery and the power of Dracula in a scene, as well as make people feel frail. And they would have in a lot of these cases, they would kind of like not iris out, but they would turn up this contrast, and like you would fade out of a scene. You would cut out of a scene as like the darkness came up, and just the brightest highlights would be the last thing you see before the scene went dark and moved on to the next thing. I love all of that.
I think it's interesting you say that, because even as late as the 50s, House on Haunted Hill, Vincent Price used a lot of the same lighting techniques in that movie. So
this film set the standard for a lot of stuff to come.
It did, and to get back to the Mexican version of the film, which I feel is technically far superior to the American version. I mean, they got to see the dailies. They got to see what was happening and say, yeah, that looks good, but we're going to do it this way. They got to see what was going on during the day, and then they went in at night, and their tracking shots were, I think, a little bit more stable. I think some of the different angles and perspectives they took exploited the actors and the sets a lot better. I do feel that the Mexican version is technically far superior to the American version. It's fun to watch, and yeah, if you have a chance to get a hold of it, it's really worth watching. It'll blow your mind.
Great. The last thing that I want to mention on production is something I usually don't talk about much, and I think it deserves to be talked about much more than it does, which is the makeup design, and the way they use the makeup in this film. This is a transitory film in that sense as well. If you look back at the silent movies, many of those old actors and actresses came from vaudeville, or from that, or from the theater, and the makeup being used was theater style makeup, or vaudeville act makeup, which was designed so that even the person in the last row could appreciate the makeup. And so in this movie, you definitely see that this is a transition from that style of makeup into a new style of makeup, because we're getting more close-up shots on faces and things like that. But at the same time, if you look at the makeup on, for instance, the actor that plays Renfield, he definitely was a silent movie actor. He's got silent movie makeup on, as well as do the Brides of Dracula. The makeup is, I'm not going to say it's all over the place, because I don't think it's bad, but you can see that it's moving into a new era of the makeup design, the way the makeup is utilized, because the makeup that works well in a theater or a vaudeville act if you're doing a close-up shot on Lugosi's face as Dracula, is going to look comical. It's going to look ridiculous. So those makeup artists had to come up with a new way of doing that. And then to be fair, when HD hit, makeup took a whole other route at that point, because suddenly people were looking completely haggard, or they looked like you could see makeup caked on them. So makeup is such a huge thing.
Yeah, the HD, of course, does a disservice to its performers, especially if you're not lighting it correctly. And looking at Dracula, I mean, I couldn't imagine the lighting rigs they had, because the film speeds weren't that great back then. So what did they have? 50K lights just up in the rafters. Any closer, you'll melt your performer. I mean, they would start to sweat. I mean, it's what they were achieving was that's why they had electricians and technicians working the lights, and the way they can cast the shadows with smaller lights, especially in close-ups, and still keep the depth of field in the background is extremely impressive. But man, I could imagine that the stand-ins were sweating a lot before they put the performers in there, because it was probably hot. I mean, but that's what makes it look good too, is that depth. And when you have film moving through a gate camera, the film speeds, that adds a softness, that adds something to the image. Even with the best lenses on the planet, which we know can make an image crystal clear, it moves differently and it feels differently. So imagine, if you will, a Dracula 1931 in HD. It wouldn't work. It would not work. That's why it's poignant in history, and that's why it's important now. Because people want to achieve that look, but they're not thinking about it correctly. They're trying to apply a completely different medium to something that's tried and true.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree with you. I think that's one of the things I took away from this movie watching it again, is that a lot of the things that are, I'm not going to say they're considered ancillary, but they're not ancillary. God, I can't pronounce that word right now. But they're not out in front of everybody all the time. Makeup, set design, special effects, those things are being developed in this movie. You could see that they're working on trying to create more dynamic sets that aren't static, that go away from the idea where you have a set piece in a Broadway show where you have to do multiple scenes on one set, and then you have an intermission and you change sets and things like that. They're trying to create sets that are more livable, that you could do things with, and it doesn't work incredibly well, but compared to later movies, but you could see that they're playing with this idea so that you think you're in the same castle, the same set the whole time, when they're going from the entrance to the castle to the stairwell to the room that Renfield is staying in, So they're trying to come up with these set designs that are cohesive and things like that. And I thought that was really interesting. And it would definitely be built on later on as movies progressed, and to the point now where sometimes when they build these sets, they build entire towns almost, for the actors to do things, and the way that these people build sets is just absolutely incredible in and of itself.
Yep.
All right, we're going to take a little break, and I'm going to give you a sneak peek of our interview with David Avallone, who is the writer for Elvira. It's part of our Halloween movie madness this month. And then we'll be right back on the back end, and we're going to talk about actors and actresses in this film, how it translates to modern audiences, and then finally, we're going to give our Cinema Crusaders score. So go ahead and check out the sneak peek, and we'll be back in a few minutes. I can't wait for you to introduce this guest to you. He is a wonderful writer. He's written Betty Page.
Can I say one thing about Dracula, the 1930s Dracula movie?
Absolutely.
Because I know that's your topic. Here's the craziest thing about that movie. I used Dracula as the villain in Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, issues 1 through 12. Very much not like the movie Dracula. But I was doing research on it. Bela Lugosi played Dracula in movies exactly 2 times. Do you know what the second one was?
I'm enjoying Elvira meeting Vincent Price. Of course, you have Elvira with her favorite film from Price's catalog as The House. Myself, I rock with Bucket of Blood. What would your preference be?
Mine is Theater of Blood, which is the one where he plays an actor named Edward Lionheart, who he doesn't get a prestigious acting award that he's expecting from this tribunal of critics, and he starts murdering them one by one in ways that are inspired by Shakespeare plays. And it was actually Vincent Price's favorite movie of his own. So actually, in the comic, his sort of, there's that thing where he changes physical appearance depending on what Elvira is thinking about or what anybody is thinking about.
Oh man!
His basic appearance that you see the most in Elvira Meets Vincent Price is the character from Theater of Blood, the black cape with the red lining, and he's a certain age, and he has a kind of flamboyant mustache and all that. So it's but yeah, that's my favorite. I do love House on Haunted Hill. That's another great one.
All right, so we're back, and that's a quick sneak peek at our interview with David Avallone. Like I said, he is the writer for Dynamite Comics Elvira. He also does Pulp Fiction podcasts on Apple Podcasts. His father was actually a Pulp Fiction mystery writer. He also wrote Betty Page for Dynamite Comics. And we talk a lot about that. I learned a lot about the Betty Page comics to the point where I actually want to pick them up now. I never had any idea what the Betty Page comics were about. They're actually right up my aisle. So we get into that as well. So yeah, definitely check that out. That'll be releasing on Monday. So let's get back into Dracula. So let's talk about the cast. Before we get into Bela Lugosi, I will admit I don't know a lot of these actors and actresses and things they did before. I know that they did a ton of work because back then, if you were a working actor or actress, you worked a lot, if you wanted to make a living at it. So you took whatever parts you could get. I would kind of like to go around to everybody and have them talk about the cast in general. And then we're going to talk about the man, so because I think it is fair to say that he is the standout when it comes to this cast because everybody remembers Bela Lugosi, for good or bad or whatever it is that you want to put on him. So I'm going to start with Steve on this one. I'm going to go to you. What are your feelings about the supporting cast of Dracula and anybody that might have stood out for you?
Yeah, this was an ensemble cast for sure. Well, aside from, Bela Lugosi, who we'll get into, but in virtually everybody else, it's an ensemble cast. And that's probably the way things worked, in silent films and on Broadway up to that point. I definitely can see, that these are people who were experienced actors who were very used to, turning in their lines and, giving the performances in the way that they did them. And particularly the guy who played Renfield and the guy who played Van Helsing were standouts. Both of those guys, you can definitely tell they had been around a while. They had paid their dues. Some of them into the silent era, more than likely. I would not be surprised if the actress who played Mina also was somebody who was very used to silent film. And so you can kind of see, that influence in the way that was put together. There were characters I wish had been in this and hadn't been. Because if you know the original book and you wrote the original story, there were two other vampire hunters. In addition to Seward and Van Helsing, who we see, and Harker, there was also Quincy Morris, who was the Texan gunfighter with the Bowie knife, who wasn't there, and I kind of wish had been there. And also, originally, this was not the house of Seward. This was not originally supposed to be set in the sanitarium. This was the house of Sir Arthur Holmwood, or Lord Arthur Holmwood, who was the fiance of Lucy at one point. And we didn't see them there. But, and you can kind of tell that certain aspects of those characters had been kind of incorporated into a lot of the others. But in terms of everybody else, and the characters that we got and the actors that they got to play them, I thought that they were perfectly solid. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more out of Lucy in this version, though we do get to see her get some good lines early on when she's introduced. So that kind of sort of counters to the fact that we don't see her much later, or she becomes less important compared to Mina, who we really just start to see sort of struggle with her being influenced by Count Dracula and all these other things. But I would say definitely for me, the standout characters, in addition to Mina, were the guy who played Van Helsing. I thought that guy had some really great moments, particularly against Dracula. That whole Battle of Will scene, I think, was his standout moment. You can definitely get to see that he is the one person in the entire room, in the entire cast, who can stand up to Dracula in a reasonable way that's believable. And with Renfield, you can tell his inner torment. This guy had been a silent film star, and you can sort of see, that he's playing that, and he's a little over the top at times. But there are also moments where he really is dealing with that self-doubt, about, whether he should obey Dracula, whether or not, he's going to be damned if he does so. And ultimately, I feel like that actor had a memorable performance, so that by the time that he reaches the ending and Dracula kills him, it's a satisfying ending for the character. And I think the way that the actor played that had a lot to do with it. So I all in all, I think that even though I didn't know any of these people, like except for Lugosi, I didn't know any of them. I came out having a certain amount of respect for these actors and realizing that these people had distinguished careers that we just didn't know about, and I wish they would have a little bit more respect today, because clearly they were talented people.
So I'm going to go to Adam next. Adam, from your perspective, listening to the performances, and having seen the picture book before, did any performance, outside Lugosi's really stick out to you and just capture the imagination?
Renfield.
Renfield?
Yeah.
Okay.
Renfield was just his performance. Yeah, really stuck out and was just really captured my imagination a bit. Is he going to, obey Dracula for the rest of the time, or is he eventually gonna stand up for himself?
So, did you really get that sense of descent into madness from Renfield listening to his performance? Okay.
Yeah, I guess sounded like he was gonna go cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
That's so interesting you say that, because like we said, these guys came from silent films, and so here he is bringing
Every
that
time
to
I hear
life.
talkies, I just get that Family Guy joke in my head now. Yeah, those two characters with the piano.
Yeah.
I also thought Lucy was sexy enough, but that's another. You can. I'm sure I can find ways to, mess up this on a Wednesday night somehow on that topic.
Well, I think it's interesting that I thought a lot of the characters looked much more comfortable and natural in that Victorian outfits and look and mannerisms, because I think they weren't too far removed from Victorian England, so it seemed to be a more natural fit on them. Before I get to Jeff, I'm going to go to Jeff next and then go to Lance. I'm going to throw this out there as another wrinkle for you guys with the cast. Bela Lugosi never learned to speak English very well. And at this time, he was a very frustrated actor because he couldn't land lines because he didn't speak English. When he made this film, he did not know any of what he was saying. He couldn't interact with his fellow actors. He learned the lines with the help of his wife and then delivered them. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to Jeff and then Lance. What do you think of the actors' performances playing off Lugosi, who obviously could not, I would imagine, never been an actor myself, really, fully interact with his fellow actors because he didn't have the ability to understand like ad-libbing or a lot of other things. So
that is pretty amazing. I was not aware of that. I knew Lugosi did struggle, but obviously in his years in America, he got to be good enough at the language to carry his own. I didn't realize that for this film. He's a Hungarian, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really impressive, and that actually makes me think of a couple of other impressive feats, like the first Hostel movie. One of the main villains of the piece, he had to learn all of his lines phonetically and interact with these American actors, and his performance is completely believable. And the great creature performer Doug Jones did the same thing for Pan's Labyrinth. He doesn't know Spanish, but he had to come across as the faun speaking Spanish, and the faun at 3 different ages. And Del Toro gives him such high praise for his performance, because he's basically having to think of this character in reverse, because the faun starts out old and gets young. So hats off to anybody who can deliver such an amazing performance and not know the language they're speaking. And Lugosi kills at it. I'm sure he understands the lines. He doesn't understand what anybody else is doing. And to see how everybody else is able to react to him as well, just is a tremendous, just tremendous ability on the part of everybody involved, that they can interact with Lugosi the same way. They're all very skilled in this fact. So my appreciation for Lugosi goes even further than it already was. But let's get on to some of the other interesting characters. Obviously, Dwight Frye, who plays Renfield, is a standout. He is a scenery-chewing machine, but that obviously comes from the silent era background, and you can see it not just in the fact that he's playing a madman, but when you had silent films, you had to be much more physical to get things apart. You couldn't have the sort of subtlety that we could have once the talkies started, and we could allow different things to sort of carry the day. You needed that physicality for a lot of things. I grew up loving guys like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, so I'm aware of a lot of the things that go into that sort of thing. And you can see it in his posturing. He does a lot with his posture. He does a lot with his expression that really does remind you of the silent era. And as you've stated earlier, Nemesis, his makeup also reflects that. When you have the extreme characters like the brides, they got the dark circles or the blended cheeks, things to just add to that performance. Even the brides doing things like, they're staring through their eyelids kind of thing at you, and the makeup enhances that. And Dwight takes full advantage of that as Renfield. He just really goes for it, and at times it does feel to be sometimes it's too much. But this is an era of filmmaking where extremes were still very useful in conveying things at the time. Subtlety would come a great deal later.
Just want to interject on Dwight Frye real quick. One of the interesting things about him is that was a very accomplished actor, was in quite a few films, died very, very young. He died in 1944, I think, at the age of 43 from a massive heart attack. He had a heart condition. So but he was in quite a few films that I'm looking at his discography, his biography now. He was in, besides Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein, he was also in the Maltese Falcon. So
wow,
go back and watch it. Yeah. So then we get Helen Chandler, who played Mina. I thought she, in a way similar to Renfield, we see the conflict within here, just as like Renfield has been totally subjugated by the vampire. His humanity keeps breaking through at points, whereas Mina's going the other way. Her humanity is starting to be submerged, and she keeps fighting against it. She has at least an instinctual understanding of what's going on, but the will of Dracula is being imposed on her, and she can't speak it outright so much of the time. So I really have to credit her performance there as well. And the poor actor playing Jonathan, him trying to he's the one guy who's really on the outs. He doesn't know, or he's in denial, and he plays that well. Dr. Seward's okay, but of course there is Edward Van Sloan, who plays Van Helsing, and he does some really interesting things. Now, first he's the smartest guy in the room, and he plays it like that. And he's always in the know, and he's always a little bit smug, a little bit egotistical to me. he's in the face of a monster, and he's always got like this kind of like like smirky smile on his face, like, I know what you are, and I'm gonna beat you. I come from the old country too, that sort of thing. And I kind of like it. I like that idea of the arrogance that comes with the highly educated, and he plays into that. And so for me, the best scene for him is when Dracula confronts him alone and tries to enforce his will upon him. And that's the one moment where you actually see Van Helsing afraid. He feels his own will and power slipping away, and he takes those steps towards Dracula, and it's very uncertain in that scene if he's going to survive. And even when he resists, he still looks shook. That is like, oh, I am maybe way in more over my head than I ever thought I was. And when Dracula goes for him physically, one thing I like talking about posturing, I really like how he has this sort of gunfighter stance. And so when Dracula goes for him, like he quick draws that cross out. I love that moment so much. And I have to feel like that all came from the actor, that whole like I'm ready to draw down, and you kind of stance, because this is really like the great showdown between the two characters. So that's absolutely fantastic. And the only other person I'll mention who I thought was quite the standout was Martin, the orderly / security guard at the asylum. I love this guy. He really is the voice of the common man, and even more than Jonathan Harker, because he's that blue collar guy. He's the guy who's got like the no nonsense comments on everything. I love the part where he's out there shooting at the bat and he can't kill it, and he's talking to the Seward's maid. He's like, they're crazy. They're all crazy. Everyone except you and me. And I've got my doubts about you. And she just goes, yes. And he's like, okay, it's just me. And slowly backs away with the gun, kind of pointing at her.
He reminded me of Michael Palin.
So great.
Outstanding. So real quick, before I get to Lance, I do want to mention, you brought up Jonathan Harker. This was one of the only characters, to be honest with you, that I was disappointed in the film.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think he brings much. There's not much written for him. And I can't believe that I'm saying this, because even though I like this actor quite a bit in his later stuff and some of his earlier stuff, especially John Wick, I think that he was incredibly miscast in the 1992 version of that Dracula. I was about to say Batman. Wow. Dracula as Jonathan Harker, which is Keanu Reeves. I just did not believe him as Jonathan Harker. And yet, if I have to choose a Jonathan Harker between those two, I would choose Keanu Reeves, Jonathan Harker. So I think that says how much I just thought that the script and the performance did a disservice to the character. So that said, Lance, on the supporting cast in this movie, any performances that really stand out to you? Any notes or comments you have on what they brought to the film?
Well, Ed Sloan and Dwight Frye, I mean, they're your awesome nuts and bolts actors. They're going to bring it. So that's always good to have in your arsenal. And we've always talked about the idea of charisma and how it's about having a presence when you perform. And of course, they have a presence like Lugosi. I mean, that's who you want to support you or rival you to make sure that performances stand out. Helen Chandler plays it subtle enough. And I think the person that falls through the cracks the most is what is his name? David Manners? See, I don't even know his name.
Yeah, I think so.
David Manners. Wow. He slipped through the cracks because and that's just due to poor writing. This is an adaptation of a stage play. And obviously at the time they still thought even the stage play isn't an accurate adaptation of the book. Everybody keeps thinking because it's told through journals and newspapers and correspondence that it's unadaptable. Well, I just think they didn't have the imagination at the time to really pull it off. And this is the version we got, and this is the version that I think everybody is kind of attuned to, this 1931 version, as the staple. even though it has those flaws in it. So as far as performances go, they're all spot on. I just think that some fell victim to poor writing versus performance. You'll have that now and again. But overall, I mean, I don't think there would have been any other way to cast the movie. And then, of course, you see the Spanish version, and you're blown away by how well the people fit the parts, 100%. So once again, technically, going back and forth to both of these films, they have their merits. But overall, I mean, it's a good cast. It's just unfortunate a couple of cast members fell short of bad writing.
Yeah, I would honestly, with Harker, I honestly blame the fact that they took all the stuff from Harker's writing early in the film and gave it to Renfield. So right. Harker was left with nothing to work with, nothing whatsoever. All he has is, oh, poor Mina. That's all he's got, because all the trauma that he went through in the beginning of the movie is not there. They gave all that to Renfield, so he's basically left as an empty character. And David Manners is left having to work with a nothing role. It's unfortunate. It
is very unfortunate, and it's kind of fun to wonder what the Broadway production was like. I mean, did he have more to do in a 3-hour play?
It's almost like, and this is going to sound weird when I say it, but it's like a character, one of my favorite characters from the Lord of the Rings books, that was cut out of the movie completely because he would have gotten the same treatment, which is Glorfindel. And they cut Glorfindel out of the book and gave his parts in the book to Arwen, Liv Tyler. So, but if they had kept him in there, he would have gotten the same treatment as Jonathan Harker here, which is he would have been an empty character with nothing to do, where you would have been, why is he even in this movie?
Right.
The last thing I will say, as far as supporting actors for me in this film, is I want to talk about the Romanian, Transylvanian townsfolk, the gypsies, the people living in the towns, the people who drove the carriage. I've never been to Transylvania. I've never been to Romania. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it was like in the Victorian times. But looking at this and looking at those performances, whoever those people were, and I can't even find their names. I mean, I'm sure they're listed somewhere.
Excuse me, they're not even like on IMDb if you go to the full cast?
No, you can't. I'm looking at all the cast and crew.
Yeah, they're so far removed. I don't even think they're listed.
That's really fascinating.
I don't think they're even listed in the. They're not listed in the credits either in the movie.
Yeah, the innkeeper, uncredited, was somebody named Michael Visseroff, and that is the only person that's even mentioned, and he's uncredited. So that's on IMDb. But I want to say that those performances, I think to this day, define what we think of as Transylvania townspeople going forward. I mean, honestly, it even in movies, animated movies like what do I think about the one with Adam Sandler played Dracula? I mean, you've got all of these films and all of the adaptions, the portrayals of people in Transylvania follow those performances, which, if you want to talk about longevity and setting a standard, is just incredible. And
like even in Lee and Kirby's comics, where there's trying to show Eastern European people, they're shown exactly like that, and that was like 30 some years later.
Right.
So it's
interesting.
It's just
I watched
a fascinating thing. Oh, go ahead.
I recently watched. I'm sorry. I just recently watched I have this ritual where I watch a horror movie every night in October to kind of celebrate. And the other night I watched Nosferatu, the Klaus Kinski version, directed by Werner Herzog, and it pays so much homage to that when Harker is going to Castle Dracula with the Romanian gypsies and the townsfolk. There's such great similarity between that, including the fact that the gypsy people both speak a language that you are not privy to watching the film. There's no subtitles or anything like that. They're speaking their native tongue. So I love that that it all came from this.
Yeah, and even in parodies, the movie I was thinking of was Hotel Transylvania, the animated movie. But even in parodies, you look at Transylvania 5000, a movie from the 80s. same thing is in there, you know. So it's like it's just an enduring image that has stayed with, you know, us. And like I said, I've never been to Transylvania. I don't know much about Romania other than, you know, I can name some towns and stuff. I don't know if that's what it's like, but yeah, just absolutely fascinating. So let's get to the big dog, you know, Bela Lugosi. So his presence, I think, just dominates this film. His stage presence. He was a Shakespearean actor in his native country. If you ever get the chance, read a biography on Lugosi. The man's life is so much more interesting than him just playing Dracula. It's not even funny. I'm not going to say that he was a good man at all times, but he was an interesting man. So, and that's all I'll say. But I think Lugosi somehow managed, you know, with no language skills, with limited amounts of movement, but just sheer magnetism and, to borrow Lance's term, charisma, dominates the film and the audience and brings through the screen to you that there is a will there in this monster that is indomitable. And that is the best word I can use to describe the character and the performance. It's indomitable. And I think so much so that it's lived on to this day, you know, and we're going to get to that when we talk about this film translating to modern audiences. I still think, even with, God help me, I can't believe I'm going to bring this movie up, Twilight, and, you know, and all those, you know, Interview with the Vampire, and, you know, all of these, you know, Buffy, and these pictures of vampires. Sometimes they're like bitchy and everything else. The enduring image of a vampire still is this image from Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And I think that has a lot to do with Bela Lugosi himself. So that said, I want to go around the horn again, and we're going to take it clockwise again. So I'm going to go to Lance. Bela Lugosi in this film, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of funny how he wasn't the first choice, you know. Even though he did the stage play and there was a language barrier, yeah, he had to learn lines phonetically. He had to, you know, it was a problem. Conrad Veidt was the guy that was pegged for this, and it's something to imagine if that would have happened. That's a staggering thing to think of. What would have happened if Conrad Veidt played Dracula? I think we would have still had something that would have lasted 90 years. And going down the line of you know, even at one point Lon Chaney was approached and then he died. I mean, all these big names that were attached to Dracula, and to actually pick a somewhat unknown was a bold move, and a foreigner to that, which is a credit to, you know, a kind of really a racist time. You know, they got a foreigner, and they have at it. He got shortchanged a little bit on his monies and what have you, because, you know, he wasn't the first choice. And then when he got the role, it was one of those things where, I mean, this wasn't a windfall for him. He didn't become a millionaire off of this movie. You know, this paved the way for history, but it didn't do anything for him financially.
Most definitely. I just, as a side note, I want to interject real quick. He had a huge rivalry with Boris Karloff, not so much because the two of them didn't get on, but because for this movie, I believe, if I remember my research right, I mean, this is not an insubstantial sum at the time, but he was paid like $500 period for the movie.
It was not a lot of money. It was not a lot of money. Yeah.
Meanwhile, when they brought Boris Karloff on to play Frankenstein, he was paid $5,000 a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
Holy.
Yeah. It was a whole different dynamic in the way of also racially, how he was kind of, you know, he was given the opportunity, but he was sold short later in his career just because of his ethnicity. It's an interesting dynamic in the whole social environment, sociological environment of Hollywood. But giving the opportunity and him knocking it out of the ballpark is the ultimate win. You know, how he was able to once again have the charisma to just be able to stand there and be a presence, and that takes a lot. You know, that takes a lot. He had it. He's the guy with the it factor. And that's what helped make the movie what it is today, 90 years later. I mean, is he the best actor on the planet? No, he is not. Can he perform? Without a doubt. And from what I understand, he showed up, phonetic or not. He knew his lines. He hit his mark. He got into character. No matter what it was, no matter how B flick or Z flick it was, he was 100% professional on the set. And that's another thing that sets performers apart from others. Being a cool person and doing your job. So I think he was a workhorse. That's what got him this part, and that's what helped. I guess, stigmatize him and raise him into history at the same time.
From what I understand, he was a perfectionist in his craft, and also, to a certain extent, was he Dracula in real life? No, but was the character he brought to life as Dracula really resemble who he was in real life? Yes. He had that kind of presence in real life. He had that kind of effect on women in real life. He was a player before player was a thing, so he was out there doing his thing, Bela Lugosi. And once again, I have to say, if you ever get a chance to read a biography of Bela Lugosi, pick it up. Even the end of his life with the whole Ed Wood saga and all that is just fascinating. So
yep. He's Dracula.
Yep. Jeff, Bela Lugosi, take it.
Oh boy, what can we say about Bela Lugosi that hasn't already been said? I mean, I'm still processing the fact that he didn't know English at the time that he did this film, and it was sad because, like you said, there was a rivalry between him and Karloff, which was no fault of Karloff's. Funnily enough, Karloff had his own speech impediment. He was a horrible lisper, and he had to work very seriously to control that when he was on set. You'll catch it in some of his films. And another sadly bitter thing is that Lugosi at a point started to wane while Karloff continued to rise, and that created an unwanted animosity, which is it's too bad. But I do like the fact that Lugosi always gave his all, like you said, no matter if it's B-list, Z-list, or what. I appreciate this so much in an actor. When I see people like, okay, I'm going to take this like little known gig, or I'm going to do it for scale or whatever. A lot of them will just do it as a paycheck in between the bigger movies, and they phone it in. And I look at somebody like Ron Perlman, who has done a lot of great work, and he's done a lot of like low grade movies. But when I watch Ron Perlman, I feel like he is always giving it his best. And that will always make a performer my favorite performer. When I see a guy who is a professional, and you take the job, and you do the job, and you give it your all. So I have much love in my heart for Lugosi for that. That even in the days of Ed Wood, even dealing with his addictions and his illnesses and his problems at the time, that he loved being an actor and creating a character and being part of this wonderfully collaborative effort that is filmmaking. Because it's not like being a writer, it's not like being an artist, it's not like anything else in the world. It is the most collaborative artistic effort that we have out there, even more than musicians. And he understood that, and he appreciated that, and he knew he was the sum part of a greater whole. And so hats off to Lugosi for everything he did and everything he put up with, and still strove to do his best as often as he could. R.I.P. man, we love you.
Outstanding. I'm going to go to Shadewing next. Bela Lugosi, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I find it really interesting that he wasn't the first choice, and I'm trying to imagine what what Conrad Veidt would have been like as Dracula, because I'm a huge fan of Casablanca, and I'm just imagining that German major from Casablanca as Dracula, and I'm like, it would have been really good, but it wouldn't have been Lugosi.
Or Lon Chaney too. So
yeah, Lon Chaney. And And Chaney was a guy who's well known for horror characters. I mean, he's the guy who did The Mummy and The Wolfman. So, I mean,
and that's Lon Chaney Jr. We're talking.
Yeah,
okay.
the dad.
Oh, that's Lon Chaney Jr.
Lon Chaney, who did Phantom of the
Senior.
Opera. You know, who did the masochistic clown? Who did the guy who pretended to have no arms and learned how to, manipulate objects with his feet? Lon Chaney was on a whole other level.
Yeah. Oh yeah, interesting. That would have been a really good choice. But
I think it would have been a much less suave Dracula and a much more horrific Dracula. So
yeah, very probably. And I think that's the thing that Bela Lugosi brought to this role that I think set him apart is the fact that he is suave, and not only is he suave, he's regal. The way that he moves himself, the way he composes himself, the physical body language of the character, all of that really is what suggests to me that this is a Transylvanian prince more than anything. It's all of these, just these little affectations, in addition to his charisma, in addition to that charm that he brings. I am Dracula. I mean, it's just, you all that put together made an iconic performance the way that nobody has been able to equal since. And you just have to put it down to, Bela Lugosi being as charismatic as he is, being able, to bring that sense of culture and that sense of style to the character, all of that. And I will add, even the dark side of Bela Lugosi makes this Dracula what it is. Because what is Dracula? He is a sexual predator who preys on women. I mean, this is somebody who, was a ladies' man for better or worse. And he put that into his Dracula, no doubt. So all of this together just created a character that I just don't think anybody's been able to equal. And there have been many great Draculas by many, many people, including Gary Oldman, including Christopher Lee, including Frank Langella. Take your pick. And yet, the guy who stands up above all of them is Bela Lugosi. And he unfortunately wasn't compensated the way that he should have. I think the studio should have given him what he was worth. It's unfortunate that he had to take that out on Karloff. That's not Karloff's fault. But, he was a great, great actor that was done a disservice. And for better or worse, though, he will survive in longevity because that performance as Dracula was so good, because he was iconic, because Bela Lugosi was born to play that character more than anybody else who has ever lived. And hats off to the man for it. You can't take that away from him.
Don't you love that? The scenes where he goes, I'm sorry, you go. My bad.
No, I was going to say, before I go to Adam, you brought up a great point, is the studio should have compensated him. He was so mistreated. The fact was that at the end of his life, he was in a sanitarium in a county hospital because he was sick and was suffering from drug addiction and things like that. Because he hadn't been in a movie and had no money, he couldn't pay for his own health. His Screen Actor insurance had run out. He had no health insurance.
He was resorting to working for Red Wood and doing these horrible B movies. I mean, I feel bad for him.
So people had to scrounge up the money for him to be able to even get treated. That's how badly he got done by Hollywood. So I'm going to go to Adam. Adam, what are your thoughts on Bela Lugosi?
Lugosi is a pimp. I'm going to put him in the Pimp Hall of Fame. As Dracula, it is a very amazing performance, and my mind was just blown that he did not know English, why he was doing this performance. Him in the Koloth, it gives me hope that I can conquer my... Hang on 1 second. Sorry about the talking computer distraction. I'm also sorry about the distraction by my dog.
No problem. I think it's funny that you say...
This, as someone who was working on his own speech impediment, brings me hope.
I think it's funny that you mentioned him as a pimp, because to quote Dave Chappelle, based on who was talking about a character who 40 years after Bela Lugosi had played Dracula, Sesame Street came up with the Count, and Dave Chappelle said, he's like, they put a pimp on Sesame Street. They didn't call him a pimp. but I know a pimp when I see one. He had a cape and everything. So
Yeah. And is as someone who's watching the movie as a visually impaired, viewer of the movie, it really flares up that imagination of the performance that much more when you hear the Dracula speak.
Yeah. Well, I did want to bring this up, and this is going to segue nice into our last segment here, where we're going to talk about how it affects. Is it relevant to modern audiences? When people are trying to conjure up an image of a vampire to use in marketing, to use.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
Dave.
Yeah.
Did you ever put Bela Lugosi's Dracula and Twilight in the same thing again? I'm flying out to California, and you and me are going to have lunch.
Yes, that is a fair statement. I will never bring up Twilight again, period, as long as I live. But what I was going to say was that you look at, Count Chocula, you look at the Count in Sesame Street. I mean, all these images, you look at Hotel Transylvania when they did Adam Sandler's animated version. It's all a representation of this role that Bela Lugosi played, which I just think is fascinating, and then, Christopher Lee played homage to that in his own way. I think Frank Langella did as well. I think, I don't know that Gary Oldman did, but, that movie I think was really an adaptation of the book, and I appreciated it for what it was. So with that said, and bringing back to mind the question I had before that I'd asked about, did it resonate with older audiences because of their ability to visualize more? I want to kick it to you guys. What do you think that the legacy of this movie is for audiences now and into the future? Is it solely Lugosi's image going forward, or does the movie itself have a future for audiences long after we're gone and stop doing this? And I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Steve and then go around the horn. So, Steve, what do you think about that?
I don't think it's just Lugosi. I think that this was a groundbreaking work of horror, even if it didn't intend to be. I think it definitely gave us the Gothic image of like the vampire castle. It gave us the idea of all these Transylvanians, living in this little town. All of these things that we associate with Gothic horror on film today, started with this movie. And everybody has sort of built on them and sort of done something different ever since then. It was also a movie that, as we talked about, really did make that bridge from the silent era to the talkie era. And I think that that's something as well we have to kind of take in consideration. Now, are most people going to think about all of those things? When they look at popular culture and they see, Dracula, or they see any kind of horror movie, not consciously, maybe not, but I think there's going to be something in the back of their mind where this movie is going to resonate long after we're all gone, I think. But I will say that the thing that a lot of people are going to remember is going to be Bela Lugosi. It's going to be that version of Dracula, and maybe to a certain extent Renfield. I think that to a certain extent Renfield, that performance of Renfield, does kind of resonate into the way where we look at that character as well. I can't think of another Renfield that has endured as much as that one. So I would say between the two of those are probably the most enduring characters, or the most enduring versions of those characters. But beyond that, I think that there's a lot of things that is going to kind of resonate in this collective unconscious, even if it's not necessarily a conscious thing. I think this movie is more influential than maybe a lot of people recognize at the time, and maybe even recognize now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I do agree. I think the Renfield performance was definitive in a lot of ways, and that the Lugosi performance as Dracula defined what a vampire was for Western audiences in a way that I think when future writers that would come afterwards wanted to do movies or films, they almost had to poke fun at that image in order to differentiate their vampires with other vampires, which was unfortunate, but it's what they did in a lot of different mediums. Anne Rice did it. A number of people have done it with different projects. Adam, what do you think about Dracula for modern audiences and future audiences? Do you think that this movie holds up for them? Is it really a horror movie, or is it a history
I
study?
really don't think that. I think I have two trains of thought on this. One, I think modern audiences are a little too damn spoiled. And we're so used to have everything, right in front of us, like the blood and the gore and all that, where, at certain points on modern artists, this may be slow paced, and it's more in to quote graphic audio, a theater in the mind, especially since you're going from, movies that are racist towards the blind. I mean, silent movies, towards talkies.
Hey, they didn't do it on purpose. They just didn't have the ability to do audio at that point. So,
I
cut him a break.
Yeah, that's my joke. Thank you.
Okay.
And my other thing is, without Dracula, especially this version of it, you really don't get anything. Without this, you're not going to have a lot of things to come. This is the first to work on doing effects where is the bat flying on wires a little hulky? Yeah. But then you turn around and you look at something like the George Reeves Superman movies where you can definitely see flying on wires.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. I think it took time for effects to catch up. The only thing that I think this outlives history is if they eventually make the real life holodecks of Star Trek: The Next Generation a thing. Then we're all screwed.
I also think that this movie had quite a influence on Halloween for all of us, especially as a kid growing up. There was at least one kid every year that dressed up as Bela Lugosi's Dracula, I think, in every neighborhood. So it was without fail. There was always at least one with the blood and the fake fangs and the whole thing. I mean, how many fake fangs were sold because of this movie? I can't even imagine.
Those little fake fangs that were like wax candy that tasted like crap.
Yeah, and hurt your gums and all that other stuff. So,
yep.
Lance, what do you think about this movie and its legacy?
Well, the legacy continues. And it's going to. Just because of imagery alone. I mean, you see Bela Lugosi's face black marketed on T-shirts everywhere on people of all ages, and whether they really know who it is or not, they know it's cool. So it lives on, and there are those that seek it out. And when they do, it doesn't matter if they like it or dislike it. The point is they've just been introduced to a piece of history, and then they know why they're wearing that T-shirt or have that sticker or that oil painting that they bought at a flea market or something. I mean, it's just something that's going to live on, just based on imagery alone. Even if they're not even going to read the book Dracula, that's where it has its foothold in cinema lore, and it's going to stay there for a very long time. And this is a movie that's in the Library of Congress. This movie is protected. This movie is not going to go anywhere. And of course, hey, you want to make films, you need to study films, and this is a film you study just based on the way it looks. Let's forget about the adaptations, performances, just photographically alone, which is iconic, and that's what gives it its longevity. I mean, you're going to always see that copy of Lugosi and every interpretation after the fact, like you said, Count Chocula, the Count on Sesame Street. I mean, you can't stamp this out. It's just going to be there, and there's going to be a lot of imitators, but this is the true cinematic version, and rightly so. So yeah, it's going to live on, and even though modern audiences won't get it, or they'll be, even though it's a very short movie, they won't have the attention span for it. I do actually think it's a movie they'll watch just because, well, who is the cool guy that I have on my shirt? And, there's a book attached to it. Hey, that might be something. I think there's a relevancy to it educationally too. So it's going to live on because it can attack those fronts artistically and literarily and image wise. I mean, it's a win-win-win. I mean, they didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know it was going to happen, but 90 years later, here it is. We're still talking about it. So it's 90 years. 100 years is 10. We're going to be around to celebrate its centennial, and it's going to be a big deal. And that's great.
I think that's one of the most amazing things is what you just said, is that when they made this movie, they can't have had any idea of what they were setting off and the indelible mark they were going to put on society. That they were creating something that was going to last for, I don't know. I can't imagine when, if ever, it'll burn out. It'll be long after I'm dead, I'm sure. So, Jeff, Legacy of Dracula. That sounds like a great movie. Legacy of Dracula. Let's make that.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that hasn't been the title of a Dracula film, since there's probably been at least 100 out there in the nearly 100 years since this movie came out. I'm going to mostly deal with iconography and legacy in terms of how it's influenced. I think everybody else has covered a lot of the other stuff, and of course, Lance brilliantly covers the cinematic legacy of the film.
Thank you.
As a filmmaker and student of film. So one of the first things that came to my mind watching this film, and it had been decades since I'd watched this, the 31 film. When I first see Renfield as he's mad, he has this very particular laugh. And I immediately flashed to, I think, maybe 1974 through, it was early 70s, like 74, maybe 79, to Love at First Bite.
Right.
George Hamilton and Artie Lang. And Artie Lang emulated.
George Hamilton.
he emulated that laugh for his Renfield. He's the whole time he's on master. He's totally doing Dwight Frye's Renfield all over the place. And of course, George Hamilton is head to toe decked out as a Bela Lugosi. He's got the slick back hair. Somewhere along the way, they decided a widow's peak was the thing, even though Lugosi didn't have it. And think about this culturally. That image, as they like to jokingly say, Dracula dressed as a waiter at a fancy restaurant, that image only really went away with the Bram Stoker's Dracula, where they started giving him period clothing of he's not wearing the same thing every single scene. He's got his homeland robes, and he's got the stuff that he wears, and he's a sophisticated man of high fashion. He's an aristo. He's got all this sort of thing going on. But that image is so indelible that this formal wear Dracula has stuck with us for generations at a time. And like Lance says, here's an image that's constantly on shirts and stickers and posters. And Lugosi is not what we consider an attractive man today. He's very short. He has a very fleshy face, exceedingly full lips, but he carried himself with such charisma and regalness. And, like thinking back on the makeup, how it accentuated his lips, those big, full lips he had. And when you go to his performance, he goes from being charming to those moments where the beast comes out, and you see this pure lust on his face, this smirking lust that he has as he looks at Mina and Lucy. And this has stood the test of time, this image of this guy that we would not consider Tom Cruise handsome or intimidating in the way that some of our modern performers would be. And yet here it still is. It still lives with us. It's still under our skin after nearly a century. The impact of the film and Lugosi himself is undeniable. It's here with us, and it will always be here with us, thankfully, because it is in the Library of Congress, and we will always have that with us. And just unrelated, I will say one last thing. I thought Swan Lake was appropriate because even though it is a romantic piece of music, it's also quite haunting, and that's very fitting.
And that goes to Adam's point on the score.
Mm-hmm.
It did fit in that way. The last thing I'll say is, because you brought up Jonathan Oldman, and I don't want to go, and maybe we'll do that movie someday, but when they changed the look of Dracula, especially the look of Dracula when he was in Castle Dracula,
mm-hmm.
It was such a departure from what I was used to, that even though it was very book accurate. It might have even been historically accurate. It was jarring. And that's how I think that speaks to how much that image has soaked into the soul, the collective unconscious of everybody. Is that departing from it feels wrong. It feels wrong. Even when it's right, it feels wrong, So it's just very interesting to say that. And there aren't a lot of things you could say that about. I mean, I'm sure we could come up with a list, but there is an awful lot of art that shines bright for a while and fizzles away and doesn't leave its mark forever. And I think it's interesting what chooses to stay in the collective unconscious and what eventually fades away, and you never really can tell.
Might I add one more thing?
Sure.
It's like you said, like that is jarring because we become so used to this other thing, even though they're trying to be book accurate with the old man Dracula in this film. And I do feel like the Coppola film did win people over by the time it wrapped up. One thing that I haven't seen really come through from this film is Dracula's very potent use, and I think it's his greatest weapon in this film, the potent use of mesmerism. Mm-hmm. And I kind of wish we would see more of that in the films, because that just allowed him to do everything in this movie. The fact that he could just dominate people's wills. And you don't really get that in the modern times because, like, as we've said, people like to see the blood and the gore. But there are those who are breaking that trend. If you look at films like the Babadook, which are all about atmosphere, all about not showing you, letting your imagination do it.
Can't believe you've seen that movie. I love that movie.
Oh, it's one of the best horror movies ever made. Yeah. Fantastic.
If you haven't seen it, go check it out. The Babadook, very good film. Another one is Oculus. So
yes,
Oculus is great.
Yeah. So, all right. So with that, we're going to wrap up, but not before we give our final Cinema Crusaders score. So I am going to start with Adam and go counterclockwise around the horn, and I'll finish it up. Out of 10, Adam, what would you rate this film?
I'm giving it a 9.
All right.
I mean, this is one of the few movies, even without audio description, that I can, now that my vision is pretty much gone, I can still enjoy and get visuals in my head clearly.
Excellent. Outstanding. Steve?
I'm leaning kind of to an 8.5, and the only reason I'm saying this is that even though it was a really great movie for its time, and it does that, there's just the bits about it that are book inaccurate kind of annoy me. Especially like when, cutting out a couple of major characters, giving Harker's backstory to Renfield and things like that. I think those are like the areas where I kind of have with it. But it is one of those things where it is a classic for a reason. It is enduring for a reason. Bela Lugosi's performance is iconic for a reason. And I have to say, one of the things that I really love about Bela Lugosi is, how they focus on his eyes when he's mesmerizing people. Just that look where they just show you his face and his eyes and how mesmerizing his eyes are. And that just adds to the feel of that. But, so there are all these things that are going for it. It's just that, those little things kind of nag at me, and there's probably just nagging at me because I'm a fan of the book. So, take it for what it's worth. So it's going to be an 8.5 all told.
You're like me. I am one of those, I don't know if this is accurate, but I'm going to say a book snob, where I read a book and watch a film, and it is a rare thing where I prefer a film over a book, because I just love books and the written word, and so I want to see everything in the book, which is impossible. It's an impossible task. So,
I wanted to see Quincy Morris. He wasn't in this movie.
Yeah. Jeff, out of 10, what would you rate Dracula?
Usually I'm on the higher end of rating these things, but I'm actually going to give it, I think, a 7.5.
Okay.
And this might be a shock to you, but I have some very definitive reasons for this. As much as I love the performances, I love the style, I love what they were trying to accomplish, there are some big plot holes that I cannot ignore. We have a scene where Renfield is creeping up on the downed maid, and it appears that he's going to just tear open her throat and start drinking her blood. And we don't see her for a long time in the film until a while later. That scene with Martin, the orderly at the asylum's out on the lawn, oh, and there she is again, and we just have no idea what happened. You know, it just leaves it wide open, and that was a big problem for me. We never deal with Lucy traveling around feeding on children as a ghoul. We have no idea if that's ever resolved. And there's a faint implication of that at the end of the film and I always thought, even as a child, this was an odd sort of cutoff when when Van Helsing sends Mina and Harker away. It's like, are you coming? He's like, no, I've got a little bit more to do here. And I had to take that as a sophisticated moviegoer that he's sticking around to find Lucy's coffin and kill her, because there were 3 coffins. So I'm guessing Dracula was planning on taking 2 brides home with him, or at least having 2 brides with him there, because he had Mina and he had Lucy. But otherwise, other than my doing that work for the film, that's a big dangling plot thread. You've destroyed Dracula, but you've still got a vampire running around out there preying on children. And
because they cut it off after Carfax Abbey.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Steve.
Because they cut it off after the Carfax Abbey stuff. There was more that was later.
Right.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I thought it was an odd decision to end the movie right there without doing that resolution. So, because of that and a few other plot holes, and the fact that, like you guys said, some of the characters are a little bit weaker, not given much to do, I can't give this movie as high a score as I'd normally like to.
Okay, that's fair. Lance, out of 10, what would you rate this movie?
7, a hard 7. I mean, it's it's poignant, it's historical, but yeah, it's flawed script wise, dramatically. Just push the book aside. Push the books aside completely. There's the book, there's the movie. But yeah, there are a lot of plot holes. There are a lot of gaps. I mean, even Nosferatu is a more full-fledged story than Dracula is. I think they captured the story better, without a doubt. A mere 4 years before, but historically, and what the movie has achieved is groundbreaking. They didn't know it at the time. I'm sure it was still a great fun movie to watch, but commercially, yeah, it's flawed because the script just isn't solid. It's not a solid script. I mean, I'll watch it all the time. I do all the time, no matter what. Even with those flaws, doesn't matter. It's still a fun movie, and it's to be enjoyed.
Well, I think that's such an important point, because just because a movie is great, maybe 10 out of 10 doesn't mean you want to watch it all the time. And just because a movie might be bad doesn't mean you don't want to watch it all the time. Some of the movies I enjoy watching the most are terrible movies, but they're just, for whatever reason, they resonate with me. So, yeah. I will say I also give this movie a 7 for a lot of the same reasons you guys were talking about. I will add that I think there must have been quite a bit left on the floor of this film. There were money issues with this movie. There were time crunch issues with this movie. The studio heads had a lot of second thoughts about this movie. In fact, they thought about canceling the project altogether at one point. There were all sorts of problems. And then I think there was the problem of the adaptation of the Broadway play. And I don't know what was in the Broadway play. I'd love to see a script sometime to see how they did it, like you guys were talking about. So I think this movie is really an experience, So as far as movie making, there's some things about it. There's some things about it that are dated, which I can appreciate it, but I've got to recognize they're dated. There are some things that I think Jeff brought up a great point that don't tie together. I thought Lance brought up a great point. I thought all of you brought up great points. Steve, Adam. So I don't think it's a bad movie by any means, but I think it's more of a movie that I like to experience than to say that if I want to enjoy the Dracula story, honestly, if I really want to watch the story of Dracula, I'll go watch the 1992 movie, because that gives me this Dracula story. But is it as satisfying to watch? Not really, because there are some performances in there, notably Keanu Reeves, that completely take me out of the film. So that said, our final Cinema Crusaders score then for the movie is 7.8. Once again, we keep our record of being like right there with IMDb. Their rating right now 49,000 people have rated this film, and it's a 7.5. So I don't know what it is. We're like a cross section of society that's like perfect here, but we're always pretty close to IMDb for the most part. So I want to thank my co-hosts for being here to kick off Halloween Movie Madness. Next week, same time, we're going to be doing Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. So make sure you tune into that. That is a cult classic and an interesting one. And I have to say, for my fellow Crusaders, I have managed to get the movie macabre version of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes with Elvira's intros and outros and everything.
Oh,
That's awesome.
So I will be sending that to you guys. So
perfect.
I want to thank Lance. Thank you, Lance, for being here with us.
Thanks for being. It was great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Jeff, thank you very much, sir.
Always a pleasure, my man.
Adam, thank you. And I know that we're going to be missing you too Halloween, so I hope you have good luck and everything.
Can I make a promise for Halloween? If I
Sure.
can find them? I'm going to get a whole box of Count Chocula on the show.
All right. And I want to wish you happy birthday, because I know you just celebrated your birthday. So happy
Thank
birthday,
you very
sir.
much.
Hey, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
And
Happy birthday.
Steve, thank you very much for being on the pod with me.
Oh yeah, always glad to be here. Always glad to discuss things like Dracula, which are things that resonate in the public conscious, and for a good reason.
Outstanding. And I want to let you all know, like I said, Attack the Killer Tomatoes. Look for other interviews we got coming out, including an interview with someone I just mentioned, the hostess with the mostest, the girl who never says no unless you ask her if she says no, Cassandra Peterson, better known as Elvira. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you all later. We're out of here.
See ya.
Bye-bye.